It wasn't a weapon of war. It wasn't forged for battle. And it didn't belong in a soldier's hand. Yet this one tool, no larger than a man's forearm, carved fear across centuries. A skinning knife, razor-sharp, ceremonial, bloody, used not for justice, but for control. In kingdoms where whispers were worth more than gold, and betrayal was as common as rain, this blade wasn't just an instrument. It was a symbol of pain, of power, of unspeakable rituals performed in the name of loyalty. In Persia, a traitor's fate meant being skinned alive as the crowd cheered. In ancient Assyria, rebellion was punished with slow, surgical flaying, the bodies nailed to city gates. In Europe, the knife passed through inquisitors and kings alike. Not hidden, but paraded. And every time it was used, it sent a message, obedience or agony. But behind the horror lay a deeper truth, one that reveals how cruelty isn't just tolerated in power, it's necessary. This is the chilling history of how rulers used skinning to control entire kingdoms, and the sickening reasons why it worked. In the dusty heart of the ancient world, where empires rose and fell with terrifying speed, fear was a currency more valuable than silver. Kings could conquer lands, but to hold them, to keep rebellious hearts in line, required something else, something primal. Enter the skinning knife. Its presence was never subtle. Curved, glinting in torchlight, often decorated with gold filigree or bone handle carvings. Not for elegance, but spectacle. It wasn't hidden in shadow. It was displayed. And where it appeared, terror followed. The earliest known records of skinning as punishment trace back to the Assyrians, a civilization both advanced and barbaric. On clay tablets excavated from Nineveh, their kings boasted of flaying rebellious leaders and displaying their skins across city walls. These weren't secret tortures. They were announcements. In one chilling inscription, King Ashurnasirpal II writes, "I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled and spread their skins out on the piles of corpses. To us, this sounds like the ravings of a monster. To his people, it was a policy. The knife was used with calculated intent. Traitors weren't killed quickly. They were carefully peeled, inch by inch, often starting at the wrists or legs. The goal wasn't just death. It was performance. To make an example, this wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was rule by theater. And as cities watched their leaders scream for hours, or even days, the message became etched into public consciousness. This is what happens when you disobey. The power of the skinning knife didn't come from its blade. It came from its visibility. Soon, other rulers took notice. From Persia to the Ottoman Empire, from feudal China to medieval Europe, flaying became a tool not only of punishment, but of propaganda. The act served as a spectacle of domination, often performed in marketplaces or city squares. But why did it work? Because skinning wasn't just painful. It was erasure. To remove someone's skin, their defining outer shell, was to obliterate their identity, to transform them from human to warning. Those who watched didn't just fear the pain. They feared becoming nameless. And it wasn't only enemies who were flayed. Sometimes, loyal servants were chosen, just to remind everyone who held the blade. But this was only the beginning. The knife had yet to reach its darkest heights, when it would be used not just to punish the body, but to manipulate the soul. The Assyrians weren't merely brutal, they were bureaucratically brutal. This was an empire that understood one fundamental truth about ruling vast territories filled with unwilling subjects. Fear is more reliable than love. And they systematized that fear with chilling precision. At the heart of this terror machine stood the skinning knife. While most civilizations reserved torture for the shadows, Assyria turned it into a political broadcast. Every flaying was orchestrated like a ritual, part execution, part theater, part psychological warfare. The body of the condemned became a billboard. Their skin, stretched, nailed, or hung like a banner, was left to rot in the elements. It wasn't just rebels who met this fate. Entire cities were punished. After the conquest of Elam, Assyrian forces skinned the city's defenders and draped their remains over the crumbling gates. It was a visual prophecy. This is your future if you resist. Records show that Assyrian kings kept detailed accounts of these punishments, almost like ledgers. How many were flayed, where, and how long the bodies remained on display. They even trained specialized executioners for the task. Men who knew how to keep victims alive for hours as layers of skin were removed. What's most disturbing isn't just the scale. It's how deeply this violence was ritualized. The skinning knife wasn't just a punishment tool, it was a sacred instrument of empire. Kings invoked the gods before the act, claiming divine authority. Victims were painted as cursed by heaven, making their suffering not only deserved, but holy. Crowds were encouraged to watch, to weep, to kneel. Fear was a form of worship. This blueprint spread like wildfire across the ancient world. Neighboring empires began adopting Assyrian tactics, not just militarily, but culturally. The idea that terror could be legislated, could be sanctified, could create loyalty through agony, became a cornerstone of authoritarian rule. And so the knife passed from king to king, from scribe to priest, from nation to nation. It moved west into Persia. It moved east into Babylon. It became not just a weapon, but a symbol, one that whispered the same message across borders and generations. You are never safe. Even the whisper of dissent could summon the knife. And in that silence that followed, that cold, paralyzing silence, rulers found obedience. But not all kings used the knife as merely a tool of punishment. Some turned it into a theater of madness, an extension of their own twisted psyches. And no one embodied this more grotesquely than a man who would redefine cruelty. Emperor Ashurbanipal. He was a king who read poetry and dissected corpses. A ruler fluent in multiple languages, obsessed with astronomy, literature, and architecture. Ashurbanipal was hailed as the most educated monarch of his time. The Library of Nineveh, his creation, is considered the first great archive in human history. And yet, beneath the robes of this so-called scholar king was something far darker. Ashurbanipal didn't just inherit the Assyrian tradition of state terror. He elevated it into an art form. Under his reign, 668 to 627 BCE, the skinning knife was no longer just an instrument of control. It became an extension of his identity, a personal signature scrawled across the bodies of the condemned. He was no distant sovereign, sending orders from afar. He watched the executions. Sometimes, he ordered them in the middle of state ceremonies. Eyewitness accounts describe him smiling as enemies were flayed before his throne. But perhaps the most chilling moment in Ashurbanipal's reign came after the rebellion of Elam. The Elamite king, Tuman, had dared to defy Assyrian dominance. His army fell quickly. His head was cut off and sent as a trophy. But that wasn't the end. Ashurbanipal ordered the remaining nobles and generals of Elam to be publicly skinned alive, their cries echoing through the capital. Their hides were nailed to walls like hunting trophies. And then, in a grotesque twist, he had the skins stitched together into banners, displayed in temples as offerings to the gods. To Ashurbanipal, this wasn't cruelty. It was order. His letters to subordinates show an eerie calm, referring to flayings in the same breath as tax collection or crop reports. One such letter reads, "I have ordered the rebellious officials to be stripped and flayed. Let this be known to all towns." No fury, no ranting, just business. What's most disturbing is how the king's intelligence fed his cruelty. He understood the human psyche. He knew exactly how to break a population without lifting a sword, through anticipation. Cities didn't need to be conquered if they believed the skinning knife was already at their gates. His propaganda campaigns featured carvings, still preserved today, depicting victims being flayed, while others wept in chains nearby. These weren't buried or censored. They were shown in palaces and public spaces. A grotesque gallery of obedience. But Ashurbanipal also feared something. He knew the skinning knife was double-edged. It bred silence, but also resentment. Rebellion simmered. And toward the end of his reign, cracks began to appear in his empire and in his mind. Some historians believe he began to hallucinate, plagued by visions of his victims. Paranoia took root. He expanded his flayings to loyal officials, accusing them of imagined conspiracies. The knife, once his tool of order, had turned inward. And when Ashurbanipal died, he left behind both a treasure trove of knowledge and a blood-soaked legacy that would inspire tyrants for centuries. But the most notorious legacy wasn't in stone or scrolls. It was in the Persian Empire, where the knife became law. When the Persian Empire rose from the ashes of Mesopotamian conquest, it brought with it not just a new vision of governance, but a terrifying blend of legalism and ritual brutality. And at the center of this fusion stood the skinning knife. Unlike the Assyrians, who used flaying as spectacle, the Persians gave it a bureaucratic gloss. Under rulers like Darius I and Xerxes, the practice wasn't merely punishment. It was justice, codified into law, reserved for a specific class of offenders, corrupt officials. But what sounds like moral integrity quickly became something else entirely. According to Herodotus, one of the most famous cases of Persian flaying involved a royal judge named Sisamnes. He had accepted a bribe. In response, King Cambyses II ordered him arrested, not imprisoned, not executed, flayed alive in public. His skin was peeled from his body and stretched over the judge's own seat of judgment. And then, in a move that seemed symbolic but reeked of psychological warfare, Cambyses appointed Sisamnes' own son to succeed him, forcing him to render justice while sitting on his father's skin. It was a masterpiece of psychological control. The knife didn't just punish crime. It prevented it. Officials, scribes, and military commanders carried out their duties with the haunting knowledge that any misstep, even perceived disloyalty, could end in not just death, but posthumous disgrace. In Persian tradition, to be flayed was to be cut off from spiritual rest. Your skin, the shell that preserved your identity, would never be buried, never mourned. And in this way, Persian rulers didn't just rule bodies. They ruled souls. But here's the darkest twist. The Persians weren't sadists. They truly believed that flaying served a higher moral function. The pain wasn't the point, deterrence was. The goal was to frighten corruption out of the system. But in practice, it became a tool of royal paranoia. Anyone could be accused. A rival, a critic, a minister who refused a bribe. And once accused, guilt was assumed. The skinning knife wasn't just wielded by the king. It became the unspoken threat in every court, every council, every temple. Even the mighty satraps, provincial governors, lived in fear of it. The Persian king was king of kings, and no one was safe. Later dynasties would claim to abandon the practice, but whispers of skinless corpses dumped in dry riverbeds persisted for centuries. Persia had taken the Assyrian art of terror and dressed it in robes of nobility, in codes and courts. But the result was the same, obedience through dread. And now, as history turned west, the skinning knife took a strange detour into the realm of religion, where pain became penance, where flesh became faith, where the knife wasn't feared, but welcomed. As the Roman Empire stretched its tendrils across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, it absorbed the customs of the lands it conquered. Some were erased, others mutated. The skinning knife was one such mutation. By the dawn of Christianity, the blade had evolved from a tool of empire into a symbol of something stranger, something spiritual. Flaying, once feared, became a path to sainthood. The most haunting example is Saint Bartholomew. One of the 12 apostles, Bartholomew traveled east, spreading the gospel in Persia, Armenia, and beyond. According to Christian tradition, he was captured by a pagan king, condemned not to the cross, but to be skinned alive. Eyewitnesses claimed he did not scream. He prayed. They say he praised God even as his flesh was torn away, inch by inch. His skin was then hung for public display, just as Assyrian kings had once done to traitors. But here's where the story fractures the expected narrative. Bartholomew became a symbol not of fear, but of holy defiance. In churches across Europe, he was depicted holding his own skin, draped over his arm like a cloak, with the flaying knife in hand. Not as victim, but victor. His statue in Milan Cathedral still stands, veins and muscles exposed, skin in one hand, knife in the other. To Christians, his suffering echoed Christ's sacrifice. But beneath this devotion lay an unsettling truth. The old, violent rituals of empires had been baptized into holiness. Bartholomew wasn't alone. Dozens of Christian martyrs, saints, and mystics met similarly gruesome ends. Some were crucified, some burned, others, like Saint Erasmus, were disemboweled alive. But skinning remained one of the most viscerally disturbing forms of execution, and thus, one of the most potent forms of martyrdom. And with martyrdom came power. As Christianity spread through Rome, stories of saints being flayed were used to shame pagan rulers, to show the strength of Christian faith. But over time, those same stories became warnings to the faithful. endure any pain for the glory of God. In medieval monasteries, skinning was even used metaphorically. Monks spoke of flaying the sins from the soul. Some orders practiced self-flagellation, stripping flesh as a form of purification. Pain became proof of devotion. And just like that, the blade had changed sides. It no longer served tyrants alone. It now served faith. But the transformation was incomplete, because even as the church embraced martyrdom, it began to wield the knife itself. During the Inquisition, skinning, or strappado flaying, a variation involving ropes and razors, returned as a method to extract confessions. Heretics were peeled under the eyes of priests. And just as the Assyrians once displayed skin on walls, inquisitors recorded their deeds in religious scrolls. Not for glory, but for righteousness. The message remained the same: obey or suffer. Whether ruled by kings or by God, the knife never lost its edge. But in the shadows of medieval Europe, a new chapter began, one fueled by whispers, paranoia, and a growing hunger for flesh not as punishment, but as entertainment. The skinning knife was about to enter its darkest age yet. If the empires of the ancient world used skinning to instill fear, the medieval world learned to monetize it. By the 13th century, Europe had become a continent of contradictions, a place where cathedrals kissed the sky while dungeons festered below. Faith ruled the soul. But flesh? Flesh became a currency, a show. And in public squares across Europe, the skinning knife took center stage. Executions had always drawn crowds. But now, they became orchestrated events, scheduled, advertised, even rehearsed. Entire towns would gather, not just to witness justice, but to be entertained by it. And few punishments thrilled more than flaying. In France, under King Louis XI, flaying became the punishment of choice for counterfeiting and treason. The condemned were tied upright, and the executioner would begin at the calves, slicing strips of skin while the town cheered, laughed, or fainted. In England, a man named William Fitzosbert, who dared incite rebellion in London, was not merely executed. He was flayed post-mortem, and his skin nailed to the city gates. For weeks, it fluttered in the wind, a ghost of revolution, decomposing in plain sight. But the most perverse stories come from Germany, where certain towns kept executioners on permanent payroll, not just to kill, but to perform. These masters of the blade were often celebrities in their own right, praised for their technique, their flair, their ability to keep a man alive for as long as possible during a flaying. Their knives were tools of precision, honed daily, sometimes heated, sometimes iced, depending on whether the goal was agony or shock. And the victims? They weren't just criminals. They were symbols. Minor offenses could be exaggerated into high treason. A baker who used less grain, a clerk who miscounted coin, a woman accused of witchcraft. All could end up in the square, skin peeling, screams echoing through cobbled streets. Children watched. Parents explained the lesson. Vendors sold food nearby. It was theater, medieval, macabre, merciless. But this era also revealed something darker than the knife: how quickly people adjusted. Within decades, public skinning lost its horror. It became normal. Writers and chroniclers began referring to flayings with dry language. A flaying was carried out in the market today, as if describing rainfall. The people had grown numb. Or worse, they had grown hungry for more. Torture manuals were published, often with illustrations. Some towns even kept records of execution popularity, judging which methods drew the largest crowds. Skinning, predictably, remained top tier. The practice expanded. Partial flaying, where only the face, hands, or chest were peeled, became common for first offenses. Repeat offenders got the full treatment. Inquisitors would sometimes skin just the feet, then force the condemned to walk through salt. And still, the knife did its job. It ruled through spectacle, not just pain. But while the knife was paraded in daylight, behind closed doors, its edge grew even darker. In secret chambers, far from the crowd, rulers and torturers began using flaying not for punishment, but for pleasure, for study, for obsession. The skin became not just a symbol, but a collectible. And one ruler in particular would redefine what the skinning knife could do, not in a dungeon, but in a palace. He called himself an artist. We remember him as Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration behind Dracula. But among those who knew his reign, Vlad III of Wallachia was feared for something far worse than steaks. He was a skinner, not a king, not a warlord, a man who viewed pain as an aesthetic. Born into a brutal world of shifting alliances and Turkish threats, Vlad grew up among sadists. But even by medieval standards, he stood out. His rule in the 15th century was soaked in paranoia, and the skinning knife was one of his favorite tools. Not because it was effective, because it was beautiful. Eyewitnesses from Saxon and Ottoman sources describe Vlad personally supervising executions, selecting not just who died, but how they died and what would be done with the remains. He reportedly commissioned flayings as public warnings, and worse, as palace decorations. Entire rooms were said to be lined with the skins of thieves and nobles alike. In one account, he flayed a Turkish ambassador for refusing to remove his turban, then stuffed the skin with straw and sent it back to the Sultan. Vlad's flayings weren't fast. He preferred slow artistry. Victims were hung upside down, skin peeled from the chest, inch by inch, their screams echoing for hours. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was to make the body tell a story, a narrative of betrayal, of loyalty enforced by agony. He didn't just target enemies. When the nobility of Wallachia opposed his rule, he invited them to a feast, then had them seized, marched for miles, and skinned en masse. Their hides were displayed on pikes beside impaled bodies. This wasn't chaos. It was message crafting. Vlad understood that fear could be sculpted, that if a man's skin could be removed like a mask, it meant no one was untouchable. Not the powerful, not the holy, not even the innocent. But perhaps the most disturbing part? His people, at least some of them, adored him for it. To peasants long crushed under corruption, Vlad's cruelty offered order. He flayed tax collectors. He flayed lying priests. He flayed foreign envoys. And through this reign of horror, he reduced crime so drastically that, according to legend, a gold cup sat untouched in the city center for years. Justice through terror, security through the blade. Flaying became not just a punishment, but a policy. And like so many rulers before him, Vlad kept detailed records of his executions, including skinning events, as proof of loyalty, not guilt. Guilt was assumed. Disobedience was sufficient. But even Vlad's cruelty couldn't protect him forever. Enemies circled. His own court turned against him. In the end, he was betrayed, killed, and, in one final twist, his body was mutilated, his head sent to the Sultan in a box. The man who made a throne from pain died a traitor's death. And yet, his legacy lived on, not just in vampire folklore, but in secret manuals, whispered rituals, and the cold, surgical precision of executioners across Europe. Because by the 16th century, flaying had begun to change again. It was no longer just punishment or performance. It became science. By the late Renaissance, Europe was crawling out of superstition and into the light of inquiry. But that light cast long, dark shadows. As universities rose and scholars searched for truth in blood and bone, the human body was no longer sacred. It was data. And with this shift came a new justification for the skinning knife. Not for fear, not for faith, but for knowledge. Dissection had long been taboo. In medieval Europe, cutting open a corpse was forbidden, its soul believed to be trapped within. But with the work of men like Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century, anatomical science broke through the veil of the forbidden and opened the body to the blade. But where did these bodies come from? The poor, the hanged, the executed, the flayed. Public executions now serve dual purposes, punishment and supply chain. As soon as a criminal's skin was peeled, the rest of the body was rushed to anatomical theaters, where eager students watched flesh stripped from bone with surgical fascination. In some universities, flaying became its own discipline. Medical illustrators studied the skin not for punishment, but for its layered complexity. They wanted to understand the body's defenses, its elasticity, its decay. And so, in freezing chambers or open-air labs, the skin was removed with care, preserved, cataloged, studied. But the line between science and sadism blurred quickly. In Padua, Italy, students reported that some professors would flay living prisoners, under the pretense of studying pain response. There are confirmed accounts of skin being peeled in stages, while others observed the victim's heartbeat, breathing, and expressions. It was called vital anatomy. Today, We'd call it torture. These were not isolated incidents. In 17th century London, surgeons offered bribes to executioners for fresh specimens. Skin peeled from the chest or abdomen would be tanned and used to bind anatomy books, literal volumes of flesh, stamped with the initials of the condemned. One such book still exists, housed in a museum in Edinburgh. Its cover? Human skin, taken from a thief flayed in 1725. A grim reminder that knowledge, like power, has its price. But the medical world wasn't alone in this descent. Occultists and alchemists, too, sought meaning in human skin. Some believed it held spiritual residue, a map of emotions and sins. They developed rituals to flay and dry it, then carve sigils and prayers into the flesh, using it as parchment for forbidden texts. In France, grimoires bound in skin were passed hand to hand, said to be cursed, or alive, or capable of whispering in the dark. And then there were the collectors. As colonial empires expanded, European elites began hoarding exotic skins from indigenous peoples, rebels, and prisoners, displayed like trophies. Museums acquired them. Private libraries kept them hidden. Some were flayed as punishment. Others were murdered for the display itself. Science had inherited the skinning knife. And like kings and inquisitors before them, the scholars believed the ends justified the blade. But in the coming centuries, one final evolution would occur, a grotesque modernity. A time when skinning would no longer be public, no longer sacred, no longer scientific. It would become industrialized. The final act of the knife was near, and it would take place inside barbed wire. The 20th century promised progress. Electricity, medicine, flight. But beneath the gleaming towers and modern ideals, the darkest traditions of the ancient world crept into the future, disguised in lab coats and uniforms. And once again, the skinning knife re-emerged. Only now, it wasn't held by kings or priests. It was wielded by governments. The most horrifying example came from Nazi Germany. Within the labyrinth of concentration camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, the body was no longer human. It was a commodity. Skin wasn't just peeled, it was processed. At Buchenwald, a place soaked in death, certain SS officers began selecting prisoners with unique tattoos. They weren't preserved as medical curiosities or scientific studies. No, they were flayed, and their skin turned into lampshades. Eyewitnesses and survivors testified that the commandant's wife, Ilse Koch, later dubbed the Witch of Buchenwald, personally requested tattooed skin to be crafted into furniture, wallets, and book covers. Bodies weren't just discarded. They were repurposed. During the Nuremberg trials, several of these artifacts were presented as evidence. Photographs showed preserved patches of human skin, some with visible ink, others dried and pressed like leather. The legacy of the Assyrian knife had reached its industrial peak. What was once a spectacle for obedience, then a symbol of justice, then a tool of science, had become a manufacturing process of horror. And this wasn't isolated. In Imperial Japan, the notorious Unit 731 conducted biological experiments on prisoners of war. Victims were flayed alive to study muscle exposure and the limits of nerve endurance. Sometimes the skin was removed without anesthesia, as doctors took notes. They called it data acquisition. The Soviets weren't innocent either. During Stalin's purges, flaying was rumored to be used by the NKVD as a method of interrogation, particularly in black sites across Siberia. Though details are scarce, survivor testimonies speak of men returned with their hands or faces partially skinned, left alive as examples. In Latin American dictatorships, dissidents were abducted and disappeared, los desaparecidos. Some were returned in bags, others never at all. The most terrifying rumors came from Argentina, where mutilated corpses appeared with skin peeled from their backs, as if signed by the state. The goal wasn't control anymore. It was erasure. Skinning had returned to its original purpose, to unmake a person, to deny them identity, humanity, memory. A body without skin cannot be buried properly, cannot be displayed with dignity, cannot be remembered without revulsion. And so it became the ultimate silencer. In modern times, we pretend the knife is gone. That torture is a relic. But reports persist, from warlords in failed states to cartel executions in lawless territories. Skinned bodies still appear. Filmed. Shared. forgotten. Only now, it's not about loyalty or law. It's about shock, about power through spectacle, just like the Assyrians. Only faster, viral, digital, disposable. And with every image that circulates, the ancient terror whispers again, you are not safe. You are not untouchable. You are only skin. But before the knife finishes its arc through time, one final chapter remains. Not of rulers, not of monsters, but of us. What does it mean to wear human skin? What happens when the horror becomes fashion? There is no deeper violation than being turned into someone else's clothing. To be skinned alive is to lose your identity. But to have your skin worn is to lose your humanity entirely. This is the final, most grotesque chapter in the history of the skinning knife, when it leaves the executioner's hand and enters ours. Not in palaces, not in temples, but in basements, attics, and locked refrigerators. Let's begin in rural Wisconsin. In 1957, police entered the home of a quiet farmer named Ed Gain. What they found would birth 100 horror films and expose a real-life descent into madness. Bowls made from skulls, chairs upholstered with human skin, and hanging from a meat hook, the peeled, hollowed body of a local woman. But worst of all was what Gain made in secret, a suit of skin. He had flayed multiple corpses and stitched together a full-body outfit, breasts, genitals, scalp, and face, so he could become his dead mother. This wasn't murder. It was transformation through skin. Gain's crimes inspired Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Silence of the Lambs. But he wasn't unique. He was the continuation of a tradition that never died. In 1980 Chicago, serial killer Larry Eiler skinned his victims post-mortem, keeping parts of their flesh as trophies. In Russia, Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, reportedly peeled and consumed sections of skin during his spree. Even more recently, in Mexico, cartel enforcers have been caught wearing the flayed faces of rivals during executions, turning their victims into masks, filmed and shared to terrorize entire cities. But this nightmare didn't stay underground. Human skin began entering the market. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a disturbing niche of bookbinding emerged, anthropodermic bibliopagy, the use of real human skin to cover books. These weren't hidden texts. Some were medical textbooks. Others were romantic poetry collections, bound in the skin of patients or prisoners. Museums across the world now quietly admit, yes, some of our books are human. And then there's fashion. During the punk explosion of the late 20th century, underground designers flirted with the aesthetics of flayed skin. Latex outfits mimicked peeled flesh. Leather was dyed and textured to resemble raw muscle. On runways and in nightclubs, the body became costume, stripped of dignity, of context, of pain. It was provocative, edgy, marketable. But beneath the performance lurked an ancient echo. We are what we wear. And if we were the dead, who are we? Even today, macabre collectors hunt for artifacts made of human skin. Items pass through auctions, through private hands, often unmarked, often denied. A lampshade here, a book cover there, a preserved face behind glass. And for every known item, how many lie hidden, locked in vaults, displayed in secret, worn in darkness? Because the truth is simple and terrifying, the skinning knife never vanished. It evolved. From the walls of Nineveh to the libraries of Harvard. From the courts of Persia to the basements of serial killers. From ritual punishment to viral terror. It persists because it works. Because it terrifies. Because we, as a species, are still haunted by the idea that the self, the soul, is only skin deep. And maybe that's all we are. The story of the skinning knife isn't just a tale of ancient horror. It's a mirror. A reflection of what power becomes when fear is weaponized. From Assyrian kings flaying rebels on palace steps, to religious martyrs transformed into icons of suffering. From Vlad the Impaler's grotesque galleries of flesh, to Nazi factories where skin became product. From the scalpel of the surgeon, to the needle of the killer, to the boots of a cartel enforcer. The blade never stopped cutting. Because skin has always been more than flesh. Its identity, its presence, its proof of being. And that's what made it the perfect target for tyrants, for priests, for scientists, and for psychopaths. What begins as punishment becomes ritual. What becomes ritual turns into policy. And policy, over time, becomes culture. So ask yourself, when does a tool become a tradition? When does horror stop horrifying? And when, in all our history, did we ever put the knife down? We didn't. We just passed it on. If this story unsettled you, you're not alone. This is the kind of forgotten history we were never meant to remember. But now you do. Subscribe for more long-form dives into the darkest corners of our past. Comment below, which part disturbed you the most? And if you want another story just as haunting, just as shocking, watch the next documentary now. Because the past doesn't stay buried, especially when it's skinned.